The Apache woman yelled. "Cowboy, what's that rattlesnake doing between your legs?" Jake Morrison had been riding since sunrise, and the Arizona sun was now beating down on him like a hammer on an anvil. Sweat dripped from under his worn cowboy hat, leaving dark stains on his faded blue shirt. His horse, a reliable mare named Dusty, moved slowly through the scrubland, her hooves crunching on the dry earth with each step. Jake was doing what he had done almost every day for the past 30 years, checking the fence lines on his family's cattle ranch. The land stretched out endlessly in every direction, a mixture of brown earth, scattered rocks, and stubborn desert plants that somehow survived despite the heat. In the distance, the mountains rose like purple shadows against the bright sky. It was beautiful in its own harsh way, but Jake barely noticed anymore. This land was in his blood. His grandfather had bought this ranch back in 1952, and his father had worked it until the day he died. Now it was Jake's turn, though he often wondered if he would be the last Morrison to call this place home. The ranch was struggling. It had been a difficult few years. The drought seemed endless, with each summer hotter and drier than the last. Feed costs kept rising, but the price he got for his cattle kept dropping. Big corporate ranches were taking over, running operations so large that small family ranches like his couldn't compete. His son lived in Phoenix now, working in an air-conditioned office, wearing a tie instead of boots. His daughter had married and moved to Tucson. Neither of them wanted anything to do with ranching. Jake couldn't blame them. It was back-breaking work, with little reward, but it still hurt. He pulled Dusty to a stop near an old dried creek bed. The creek had once run year-round when Jake was a boy. He remembered swimming in it during hot summer days, the water cool and clear. Now it was just cracked mud and scattered rocks. He dismounted slowly, his knees protesting. 58 years old, and his body reminded him of it every morning. He tied Dusty's reins to a scraggly mesquite tree and walked over to a large boulder that offered a bit of shade. Jake sat down heavily, leaning his back against the sun-warmed rock. He pulled out his water bottle and took a long drink, then poured some into his hat for Dusty. The horse drank gratefully. Jake closed his eyes for a moment, just resting. The silence of the desert surrounded him. Not complete silence, but the quiet buzz of insects, the occasional call of a bird, the whisper of a hot breeze through the dry grass. What Jake didn't notice was the rattlesnake. It had been there first, coiled in the small patch of shade beside the boulder, trying to escape the deadly heat. The snake was a diamondback, nearly 5 feet long, with distinctive diamond patterns along its back, and a rattle that could sound like dry leaves shaking in the wind. It was a magnificent creature, perfectly adapted to this harsh environment, and like most rattlesnakes, it wanted nothing to do with humans. It would have crawled away if given the chance, but Jake had sat down too quickly, too close. Now the snake was trapped between Jake's outstretched legs, coiled tightly, feeling threatened and defensive. Jake sat there, eyes still closed, completely unaware of the danger just inches from his body. 300 yards away, Nala Sosi was lying on her stomach, on top of a small ridge, looking through a pair of binoculars. She was scanning the area for snake activity, marking down locations and species as part of her research project. Nala was 34 years old, with long black hair pulled back in a practical braid and dark eyes that missed nothing. She wore hiking boots, khaki pants, and a light long-sleeve shirt to protect against the sun. A backpack beside her contained her field notes, GPS unit, camera, and snake handling tools. Nala had grown up on the San Carlos Apache Reservation, about 40 miles from where she now worked. Her grandfather had been a respected elder who taught her about the desert, its plants, its animals, and the old ways of living in harmony with the land. He had passed away when she was 16, but his lessons stayed with her. She had been the first in her family to go to college, eventually earning a doctorate in ecology from the University of Arizona. Now she was back, conducting research on how human activity, particularly cattle ranching, affected native snake populations. She was adjusting her binoculars when she spotted the cowboy sitting against the rock. She was about to move on, but something made her look more carefully. Her breath caught in her throat. There, clear as day through her magnified view, was a large diamondback rattlesnake, coiled between the man's legs. The cowboy was completely oblivious, sitting there with his eyes closed like he was taking a nap. Nala's mind raced. If the man moved suddenly, the snake would strike. A bite from a rattlesnake that size could be deadly, especially out here, far from medical help. Even if he survived, he could lose his leg or suffer permanent damage. She had to act fast. She grabbed her snake hook and bag and started running down the ridge, stumbling over rocks in her haste. As she got closer, she could see the situation was even more dangerous than she thought. The snake was clearly agitated, its body tense, its head raised slightly in a defensive position. "Cowboy!" she yelled at the top of her lungs. "Don't move. There's a rattlesnake between your legs." Jake's eyes snapped open. His first instinct was to jump up, but the panic in the woman's voice made him freeze. He looked down slowly, moving only his eyes, and felt his blood turn to ice. There it was, a massive diamondback, coiled tight, its rattle already buzzing a warning that sounded like death itself. Time seemed to stop. Jake's heart hammered so hard he thought it might burst through his chest. Every muscle in his body wanted to move, to run, to get away from this deadly creature, but he forced himself to stay absolutely still. He had lived in this desert his whole life. He knew that rattlesnakes didn't want to bite people. It wasted their venom, but they would if they felt threatened. And the snake definitely felt threatened. Nala approached carefully, speaking in a calm, steady voice, even though her own heart was racing. "I'm coming to help you," she called out. "Just stay exactly as you are. Don't move a muscle. Don't even breathe heavy if you can help it." Jake couldn't have moved if he wanted to. Fear had locked his body in place. He watched from the corner of his eye as the Apache woman came closer, carrying what looked like a long metal hook. She moved with confidence, but also with deep respect for the snake. "I'm a wildlife biologist," Nala said softly as she approached. "I work with snakes all the time. We're going to get through this, but you need to trust me and do exactly what I say." I'm listening," Jake managed to whisper, his voice tight with fear. Nala circled around, positioning herself so she could reach the snake without making it feel more cornered. She spoke in a low, soothing voice, partly to calm Jake, partly to calm herself, and partly out of respect for the snake. "This beautiful creature is just as scared as you are. It doesn't want to bite you. It just wants to get somewhere safe." She extended the snake hook slowly, talking the whole time. "I'm going to slide this hook under its body. When I lift it, it's going to focus on the hook, not on you. That's when you need to slowly, very slowly pull your legs back toward you. Can you do that?" "Yes," Jake whispered. Nala took a deep breath and gently slid the hook under the snake's thick body just behind its head. The snake's rattle increased its buzzing, angry and warning. With practiced skill, Nala lifted the hook, raising the front portion of the snake off the ground. The snake's attention shifted entirely to this new threat. "Now," Nala said quietly, slow and steady. Jake pulled his legs back inch by inch, moving so slowly it was almost imperceptible. Sweat poured down his face, partly from the heat, partly from fear. The snake writhed on the hook, its powerful body twisting, but Nala held it firmly, keeping it away from Jake. Once Jake was clear, Nala expertly maneuvered the snake into a large canvas bag she had brought. She closed the top securely and let out a long breath. "Okay, you can breathe now." Jake stood up on shaky legs, his whole body trembling. He took off his hat and wiped his forehead with his sleeve. "Lady," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I think you just saved my life." Nala smiled, but there was still adrenaline in her system making her hands shake slightly. "Just doing my job? Well, sort of. Rescuing cowboys isn't exactly in my job description, but I'm glad I was here." They stood there for a moment, two strangers brought together by a moment of crisis. Jake looked at this woman who had appeared out of nowhere and handled that deadly snake like it was nothing more than a garden hose. "I'm Jake Morrison," he said, extending his hand. "Na let so say," she replied, shaking his hand firmly. Her grip was strong and confident. "What are you doing out here anyway?" Jake asked, his breathing finally returning to normal. "Research," Nala explained. "I'm studying snake populations in this area, documenting how they're affected by different land uses. I was up on that ridge doing observations when I saw you sit down." She gestured to the bag. "I'm going to relocate this guy somewhere safer for both of you." Jake looked at the bag with a mixture of fear and fascination. "I've lived here my whole life, and I've never been that close to a rattler. Not like that, anyway." "You were lucky," Nala said, "and I was lucky to be in the right place at the right time." She paused, studying Jake's face. He still looked pale, shaken. "My truck is about a mile north of here. Can I give you a ride back to wherever you're headed? You probably shouldn't be riding just yet." Jake wanted to say he was fine, that he didn't need help, but his legs were still wobbly and his hands hadn't stopped shaking. "My ranch is about 3 miles east," he said. "If you don't mind, I'd appreciate a ride, and the least I can do is offer you some water and a chance to cool off before you head back out in this heat." Nala agreed, and they walked together to where her truck was parked, with Jake leading Dusty by the reins. As they walked, they talked, awkward at first, then more naturally. It was the beginning of something neither of them could have predicted, a connection formed in a moment of danger that would change both their lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The following week, Jake was out mending a section of fence near the eastern boundary of his property when he saw a familiar truck kicking up dust on the dirt road. He recognized it immediately. Nala's old Ford, now with new tires replacing the ones that hadn't been damaged yet. She pulled up beside him and stepped out, carrying her field equipment and a clipboard. "I hope you don't mind," she called out. "This area is part of my survey route." "I promise I'm not trespassing without permission." Jake wiped his hands on his jeans and walked over. "After what you did for me, you're welcome on my land any time. Find any more snakes today?" Nala smiled and showed him her field notes. She had already documented 3 different species that morning, all harmless to humans. As she talked about her work, Jake found himself genuinely interested. She explained how snakes were actually beneficial to ranchers because they controlled rodent populations that could damage crops and spread disease. She talked about the delicate balance of the desert ecosystem, how everything was connected in ways most people never noticed. "You really love this stuff, don't you?" Jake observed, leaning against her truck. "I do," Nala admitted. "Growing up on the reservation, my grandfather taught me to respect every creature. He said that everything has its place and purpose. When I went away to college, I wanted to prove that scientifically, to show that traditional knowledge and modern science often say the same things in different languages." Jake was quiet for a moment, then asked, "How did your family feel about you leaving the reservation for school?" Nala's expression became more complicated. "Mixed feelings. My grandfather was proud, encouraged me to learn everything I could, but some people thought I was trying to leave my heritage behind, become white. Then when I came back with my degree, some folks said I was too educated, too influenced by outside ideas. You can't win sometimes." "I know something about that," Jake said. "My kids both left ranching. Some people around here act like I failed as a father because I couldn't convince them to stay. But I look at their lives, steady paychecks, air conditioning, weekends off, and I can't blame them for choosing differently." They talked for another hour, sitting in the shade of Jake's truck. Nala explained more about her research project. She was trying to document how different ranching practices affected wildlife. Some methods were clearly harmful: overgrazing that destroyed plant life, excessive water use that dried up natural sources, indiscriminate use of rodent poison that killed snakes and hawks. But other practices could actually support wildlife if done thoughtfully. The problem, she explained, was that ranchers saw her as the enemy. They thought she was collecting evidence to shut them down, to bring in government regulations that would destroy their way of life. Most refused to talk to her. Some had run her off their property. The hostility made her work much harder than it needed to be. Jake listened carefully. "I'll be honest with you," he said. "A month ago, if someone told me a government scientist wanted to study my ranch, I would have said no too. We've had so many people come out here telling us we're doing everything wrong, that we're destroying the environment, that we should just quit and let the land go back to wilderness. It gets old after a while. I understand that frustration," Nala said. "But I'm not trying to destroy ranching. I grew up with people who raised cattle and sheep. I know it's hard work and that most ranchers care deeply about their land. I just think there might be ways to do things that are better for everyone, including the ranchers." Over the next few weeks, Nala stopped by Jake's ranch several times. At first, it was just during her regular survey work, but soon she was coming by specifically to talk. Jake found himself looking forward to her visits. His days were usually solitary, just him, his horse, and the cattle. Having someone to talk to was a welcome change. One afternoon, Nala brought some old photographs that her grandfather had kept. They showed the same landscape they were standing in, but from 70 years earlier. The difference was striking. In the old photos, the grass was thicker, the creek beds had water, and the land looked healthier overall. "What happened?" Jake asked, studying the photos closely. "Lots of things," Nala explained. "Climate change is part of it. The region is definitely getting hotter and drier, but land management practices played a role too. My grandfather used to talk about how Apache people managed the land. They used controlled burns to encourage new growth. They moved their animals frequently so the grass could recover. They understood that you couldn't just take from the land, you had to give back too." Jake was skeptical. "Controlled burns? Out here? That sounds dangerous." "It can be if you don't know what you're doing," Nala agreed. "But when done right, at the right time of year with the right conditions, fire clears out dead plant material and encourages new growth. The seeds of many native plants actually need fire to germinate. Without it, invasive species take over." She went on to explain other traditional practices. Instead of keeping cattle in the same area all the time, her ancestors moved them frequently, mimicking how wild buffalo used to migrate. This gave the land time to recover between grazing periods. They also knew which plants indicated healthy soil and which ones meant the land was struggling. My grandfather had a name for every plant, knew what it was good for, medicine, food, or just keeping the soil healthy. That knowledge is disappearing because young people aren't learning it anymore. Jake thought about his own grandfather, who had known this land in ways Jake had never quite mastered. The old man could predict weather by watching the animals, knew where to find water even in drought years, understood things that couldn't be learned from books. That knowledge had died with him because Jake's father hadn't paid attention, and Jake himself had been too busy with the day-to-day work of keeping the ranch running. "What if..." Jake said slowly, an idea forming. "We tried some of these old methods on part of my ranch, like an experiment. Nothing too crazy, just small changes to see if they make a difference." Nala's eyes lit up. "Really? You'd be willing to do that?" "I'm desperate enough to try anything," Jake admitted. "The way I'm doing things now isn't working. Every year I'm losing money, the land looks worse, and I'm running out of options. If some of these traditional practices could help, I'd be a fool not to at least try." They spent the rest of the afternoon walking Jake's property, with Nala pointing out things he had never noticed before. She showed him areas where the soil was compacted from cattle staying in one place too long. She identified invasive plants that were choking out native grasses. She explained how the lack of variety in plant life meant fewer insects, which meant fewer birds, which disrupted the entire food chain. But she also pointed out things that were working well. Jake had kept several groves of trees intact, which provided crucial shade and habitat. He had maintained some natural water catchments that held rainwater longer than the surrounding areas. He instinctively rotated his cattle more than many ranchers did, even if he didn't do it as frequently as he could. "You're not starting from zero," Nala assured him. "You're already doing some things right. We just need to build on that." They selected a 50-acre section of the ranch to use as a test area. It was large enough to provide meaningful data, but small enough that if something went wrong, it wouldn't destroy Jake's entire operation. Nala would document everything: soil conditions, plant species, water retention, wildlife activity, before they made any changes. Then they would implement some traditional practices and monitor the results over time. Jake felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety. This partnership could help save his ranch, or it could be a waste of time and resources he didn't have to spare. But doing nothing definitely wasn't working, so taking a chance seemed like the smart choice. What neither of them fully considered was how other people would react to their collaboration. The ranching community in this part of Arizona was tight-knit and traditional. Ranchers helped each other during hard times, shared information about cattle prices and weather, and stuck together against outside threats. An Apache scientist studying ranching practices was already viewed with suspicion by many. A rancher working with her would be seen as betrayal. The first sign of trouble came when Jake stopped at the feed store in town the following Saturday. He had been going to Morrison's Feed and Supply for 30 years. It was where his father and grandfather had shopped. Old Mr. Morrison had retired, and his son Carl ran the place now. Jake was loading bags of feed into his truck when Carl came out. "Heard you've been spending time with that Indian woman who's been poking around everyone's property," Carl said without greeting or preamble. Jake straightened up, immediately defensive. "Her name is Nala Tsozi, and she's a wildlife biologist doing legitimate research. Research to put us all out of business, more like," Carl said. "She's collecting evidence for the environmental groups. Next thing you know, we'll have the federal government coming in with new regulations telling us we can't graze cattle on our own land." "That's not what she's doing," Jake protested. "She's actually trying to find ways to make ranching more sustainable," Carl snorted. "That's what they all say. My advice? Stay away from her." "People are already talking, Jake. Wondering whose side you're on." Jake felt anger rising in his chest. "I'm on the side of saving my ranch. If you've got better ideas, I'm listening. Otherwise, I'll work with whoever can help me keep this operation running." He finished loading his feed and drove off, but the conversation bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Carl wasn't a bad person. He was worried about his own business and his customers. If the ranches failed, his feed store would fail too. Jake understood that fear, but he also knew that fear alone wouldn't solve their problems. That evening, Jake called Nala to tell her about the conversation. She sighed heavily on the other end of the line. "I was afraid this would happen. I've faced this kind of resistance before. Some people see cooperation as weakness or betrayal." "Are you having second thoughts?" Jake asked. "No," Nala said firmly. "Are you..." Jake thought about his dwindling bank account, his aging body, his children who had built lives elsewhere. He thought about the land his grandfather had loved, now struggling under years of drought and perhaps years of practices that weren't quite right for this changing climate. "No," he said, "I'm not having second thoughts. Let's do this." The whispers started small, like a distant wind that gradually picks up strength. Jake first noticed it at the monthly Cattlemen's Association meeting held in the community center in town. He had been attending these meetings for over 20 years, sitting in the same general area, chatting with the same group of ranchers before things got started, but this time when he walked in, conversation stopped. Men who usually greeted him with handshakes and jokes simply nodded and turned away. Tom Brennan was there, holding court near the coffee station as he always did. Tom owned the largest ranch in the county, over 15,000 acres that had been in his family even longer than the Morrison Ranch had been in Jake's. He was a big man with silver hair and a voice that commanded attention. He was also the kind of person who expected others to follow his lead. "Well, look who decided to show up," Tom said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Thought maybe you'd be too busy with your new research project to bother with us regular ranchers." Jake felt every eye in the room turn toward him. "Just here for the meeting, same as always, Tom." "That right?" Tom stirred his coffee slowly, deliberately. "Heard you've been letting that Apache woman crawl all over your property? Taking notes, collecting data. You know what she's going to do with all that information, Jake?" "She's studying wildlife populations," Jake said evenly, though he could feel his temper starting to rise, trying to understand how different practices affect the ecosystem. "Ecosystem," Tom repeated, making the word sound like a curse. "Let me tell you what's going to happen. She's going to write a report saying we're all destroying the land. Then the environmental groups will use that report to push for new regulations. Before you know it, we'll have government inspectors out here telling us how many cattle we can run, where they can graze, when we can move them. Is that what you want?" "That's not what this is about," Jake protested, but his voice was drowned out by murmurs of agreement from the other ranchers. An older man named Pete Henderson spoke up. "My cousin up in Montana went through this same thing. Researcher came through, did a study, and within 2 years they had so many restrictions they couldn't make a profit anymore. Had to sell out to a big corporation. That what you want for us, Jake?" "Of course not," Jake said, frustration building. "But we can't just ignore the problems we're facing. The drought isn't getting better. Costs keep going up. We need to find new approaches or we're all going to go under anyway." "New approaches," Tom scoffed. "Your grandfather and my grandfather worked this land just fine without needing some college-educated Indian girl to tell them how to do it." The racial edge to Tom's comment made Jake's hands clench into fists. "Her name is Dr. Tsuzi, and she knows more about desert ecology than anyone in this room. Maybe if we listened to people who actually studied this stuff instead of just doing things the way we've always done them, we'd be in better shape." The room went silent. It was one thing to disagree, another to criticize the traditional ways openly. Jake had crossed a line, and he knew it. Tom set down his coffee cup with a hard clink. "You better think carefully about the choices you're making, Jake. When times get tough, and they will get tougher, you're going to need friends. You're going to need people who will help you out, buy your cattle, share information, lend equipment. You keep going down this path, you might find yourself pretty lonely out there." The meeting started shortly after, but Jake barely heard any of it. He sat in the back, feeling isolated in a room full of people he had known for decades. After it ended, a few ranchers approached him, younger ones mostly, asking quietly about what he was doing, seeming genuinely curious. But they spoke in low voices, careful not to be overheard, as if association with Jake had become dangerous. Meanwhile, Nala was facing her own challenges. She had returned to the San Carlos reservation to visit her mother and attend a community meeting about economic development. During the discussion, the topic of land use and environmental protection came up. A young activist named Marcus stood up and spoke passionately about the history of Apache land being stolen, about how ranchers were occupying territory that rightfully belonged to native peoples. "We shouldn't be helping these ranchers figure out how to be more efficient," Marcus argued. "We should be working to reclaim our ancestral lands, not making it easier for them to profit from what they took from us." Several people nodded in agreement. Nala raised her hand to speak. "I understand the anger," she began carefully. "Our people have suffered terrible injustices, and that history matters. But most of the ranchers working this land today weren't the ones who took it. They're just people trying to survive, like we are. Some of them are struggling so badly they might lose everything." "Good," someone muttered from the back. Nala continued, "But what happens when they lose their ranches? Big corporations buy up the land. They bring in industrial operations that are much worse for the environment. They hire workers from out of state instead of from local communities. They have no connection to this place, no reason to care about it. At least small ranchers live here, raise their families here. We can work with them, find common ground." Marcus wasn't convinced. "You're being naive, Nala. They'll never really accept us as equals. You're giving them scientific knowledge that our ancestors developed, helping them profit from it, and you think they'll be grateful? They'll use what you teach them and still look down on us." Her mother caught up with her after the meeting. "You're doing important work," she said quietly. "But be careful. You're walking between two worlds, and people in both worlds are going to question your loyalty." "I'm just trying to do what Grandfather would have wanted," Nala said. "He always said knowledge should be shared, that we're all connected to the land regardless of our background." "Your grandfather was a wise man," her mother agreed. "He was also someone who made enemies because he refused to hate people just because they were different. It's a hard path to walk." The situation grew more tense when the local newspaper, the Desert Valley Chronicle, published an article about Jake and Nala's collaboration. The reporter had heard rumors and decided to investigate. The article was titled, "Unlikely Partnership. Rancher and Tribal Scientists Join Forces." It featured interviews with both of them, explaining their project and their goals. The reporter tried to present it as a positive story about cooperation and innovation, but the reaction was swift and divided. The newspaper's website comment section exploded with opinions. Some people praised the collaboration as forward-thinking. Others condemned it as naive or even treasonous to their respective communities. Environmental groups from outside the area took notice. Some reached out to Nala, offering support and asking if they could observe the project. She politely declined most of these requests, knowing that having outsiders descend on Jake's ranch would only make things worse. But their interest caught the attention of the ranching lobby, which saw it as confirmation of their worst fears. A representative from the Western Cattlemen's Association called Tom Brennan to express concerns. If this project showed that traditional ranching practices were harmful, it could fuel efforts to impose new regulations across the entire region. Tom took this as validation of his warnings to Jake. Jake started noticing other changes. At the hardware store, service was slower than usual. The owner wasn't openly rude, but he wasn't friendly either. At the diner where Jake usually had breakfast on Saturday mornings, the table where he normally sat with other ranchers was full, with no chair pulled out for him as there used to be. Small things, but they added up to a clear message. He was being pushed out. One evening, Jake found a note tucked under his windshield wiper at the grocery store. It was handwritten, anonymous. "Traitors get what they deserve. Watch your back." Jake crumpled it up and threw it away, but the threat bothered him more than he wanted to admit. He called Nala that night to tell her about it. "Maybe we should slow down," he suggested. "Let things cool off for a while." "Is that what you really want?" Nala asked. Jake looked out his window at the darkening landscape, the land he loved and was desperately trying to save. "But I don't want you getting hurt because of me. If people are willing to leave threatening notes, what else might they do?" "I've dealt with threats before," Nala said, though her voice carried an edge of worry. "The question is whether you're ready to keep going despite the pressure." Before Jake could answer, they were interrupted by a development that changed everything. The test plot they had established was beginning to show results, and they were remarkable. Nala had been monitoring the 50-acre section closely, documenting everything. They had implemented rotational grazing, moving the cattle more frequently and giving the land time to rest between grazing periods. They had introduced controlled burning on a small section, carefully managed to prevent any danger. They had planted native grasses that Nala's research suggested were more drought-resistant than the species currently dominating the area. After just 2 months, the differences were becoming visible. The grass in the test area was recovering faster and growing thicker than on the rest of the ranch. Soil samples showed improved moisture retention. Wildlife cameras had captured images of animals that hadn't been seen on the property in years. A family of javelinas, several species of birds, even a bobcat. Most importantly for Jake's bottom line, the cattle that had been grazing in the test area were healthier. Their weight gain was better than the rest of the herd, which meant they would fetch higher prices at market. Nala compiled all the data into a preliminary report. The results were so promising that she submitted them to a regional conference on sustainable agriculture. To their surprise, the proposal was accepted. They were invited to present their findings to an audience of ranchers, scientists, and agricultural professionals from across the Southwest. "This could be huge," Nala said excitedly when she got the acceptance letter. "If we can show other ranchers that these methods actually improve their profits while helping the environment, it could change minds across the entire region." Jake was more cautious. "Or it could make us even bigger targets. Tom and his allies aren't going to be happy about us presenting this to a wider audience." "Probably not," Nala admitted. "But isn't that the point? If these methods work, and the data shows they do, don't we have an obligation to share that information? How many ranchers are struggling right now who could benefit from this?" Jake knew she was right. Despite the threats, despite the isolation, despite everything, the work they were doing mattered. It wasn't just about saving his ranch anymore. It was about proving that there was another way forward, that traditional ecological knowledge and modern ranching didn't have to be enemies. "Okay," he he said finally. Let's do the presentation. But we need to be prepared for backlash. This is going to make some people very angry. Neither of them realized just how right Jake was. The announcement of their upcoming presentation spread quickly through the local ranching community. Tom Brennan saw it as a direct challenge, a public declaration that his way of doing things was wrong. He began making phone calls, organizing opposition, and preparing to make sure Jake Morrison understood the consequences of his choices. The conflict that had been simmering beneath the surface was about to boil over, and both Jake and Nala would soon face tests that would determine not just the fate of their project, but the future of their livelihoods and possibly their safety. The drought continued to worsen through the fall, turning what had been a difficult situation into a genuine crisis. Wells that had provided water for generations began to run dry. Ranchers watched helplessly as their water trucks made more and more trips to fill tanks, each gallon costing money they didn't have. The grass turned brown and brittle, crunching underfoot like broken glass. Cattle prices dropped as everyone tried to sell at the same time, flooding the market with animals they could no longer afford to feed. Jake stood on his porch one evening, watching the sunset over his struggling land. He had just written out checks for bills he wasn't entirely sure he could cover. The bank had called twice that week about his loan payments. He was 2 months behind, and they were getting impatient. The preliminary results from the test plot were encouraging, but they hadn't had time to translate into real financial relief. He was still bleeding money, still watching his life's work slip through his fingers like sand. His phone rang. It was Nala, and her voice was shaking with anger and fear. "Someone vandalized my truck," she said. "I was out in the field all day, and when I came back to where I'd parked it, the tires were slashed. All 4 of them. And there was spray paint across the side." "What did it say?" Jake asked, though he had a sick feeling he already knew. "Go home," Nala replied bitterly. "As if the reservation isn't my home just as much as this area is. As if I don't belong here." Jake felt anger rising in his chest. "Did you call the sheriff?" "Yeah. Deputy Martinez came out, took photos, wrote a report, but he basically told me not to get my hopes up about finding who did it. Said there weren't any witnesses, no cameras out there, nothing to go on. He suggested I be more careful about where I park, like this was somehow my fault. I'm so sorry, Nala. This is because of our project, because people are angry about what we're doing." "Maybe," Nala said. "Or maybe it's just because I'm Apache and some people will use any excuse to remind me I'm not welcome. Either way, I'm not backing down. I called a tow truck, I'll get new tires tomorrow, and I'll be back out in the field doing my work." Her courage shamed Jake. Here she was, facing direct threats and vandalism, and she was ready to keep going. Meanwhile, he had been sitting on his porch feeling sorry for himself about money problems. "We'll get through this," Jake said, with more confidence than he felt. "The presentation is in 3 weeks. Once people see the data, once they understand that this isn't about shutting anyone down but about helping everyone survive, things will get better." But things got worse before they got better. A week later, Jake woke up at dawn to the sound of his dog barking frantically. He pulled on his boots and grabbed a flashlight, stepping out into the cold morning air. Something was wrong. He could feel it. The cattle should have been settled in the east pasture, but he could hear them in the distance, their calls agitated and confused. He jumped in his truck and drove toward the sound, his headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. What he found made his blood run cold. A section of fence had been cut, not broken by weather or accident, but deliberately cut with wire cutters. The posts had been pulled aside, creating a wide gap. His cattle had wandered through the opening onto the county road that ran along his property. Jake drove up and down the road in the growing light, counting animals and assessing the damage. 3 cattle had been hit by vehicles during the night. They lay dead in the ditch, a devastating loss. The rest of the herd had scattered across neighboring properties and further down the road. It took him all morning, calling in favors from the few ranchers who still spoke to him, to round up the wandering animals and get them back onto his property. The financial loss was crushing. 3 breeding cows represented thousands of dollars he couldn't afford to lose. The damaged fence would cost money to repair. The neighboring ranchers whose property his cattle had trampled would expect compensation for any damage, and there was the time. Hours and hours of work that he should have been spending on other urgent tasks. But worse than the financial impact was the certainty that this had been deliberate. Someone had done this to him on purpose. Someone had sabotaged his operation, endangered his animals, and potentially could have caused a serious accident if a car had hit one of his cattle at high speed. He called the sheriff's office, and this time Sheriff Coleman himself came out. He was a weathered man in his 60s who had known Jake's family for years. He examined the cut fence, took photos, asked questions, but his conclusions were the same as his deputies had been with Nala's truck. "I'll investigate, Jake, but I'll be honest with you. Unless someone saw something or decides to come forward, this is going to be hard to prove. Could have been kids, could have been someone with a grudge, could have been a competitor trying to hurt your operation. You know this wasn't kids or random vandalism, Jake said. This is about me working with Nala, about the project we're doing. Someone's trying to send me a message. Sheriff Coleman sighed. Off the record, you've stirred up a lot of feelings in this community. People are scared about their futures, and scared people sometimes do stupid things. My advice would be to keep your head down for a while, let things settle. Keep my head down? Jake repeated incredulously. Someone just destroyed my fence and cost me thousands of dollars. I'm supposed to just accept that? I'm saying be smart, the sheriff replied. I'll do what I can, but you need to think about whether this fight is worth it. After the sheriff left, Jake sat in his truck in the middle of his property, feeling more alone than he had in years. He thought about his grandfather, who had built this ranch from nothing. He thought about his father, who had worked himself into an early grave trying to keep it running. He thought about his own children, who had chosen different lives because they saw how hard this one was. Was it worth it? Was saving this ranch worth becoming an outcast in his own community? Worth putting himself and Nala at risk? That afternoon, Tom Brennan's truck pulled up to Jake's house. Tom got out slowly, taking his time, making it clear he was coming as a man in a position of power, not as an equal. Jake met him on the porch, not inviting him in. Heard you had some trouble last night? Tom said without preamble. Shame about those cows. 3 head is a hard loss, especially in times like these. If you came here to gloat, Tom, you can leave right now. Gloat? No. Jake, I came to make you an offer. A good one. Tom pulled out a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. I'm prepared to buy your ranch. This is my offer. It's fair. More than fair, actually, given the shape things are in. Jake didn't even look at the paper. My ranch isn't for sale. Everything's for sale at the right price, Tom said. Look, I know you're struggling. I know you're behind on your bank payments. I know you just lost 3 head and you've got repairs to pay for. This offer would clear your debts and leave you with enough to start fresh somewhere else. Maybe closer to your kids in Phoenix. And you'd own this land, Jake said. You'd control the water rights, and you'd have a continuous property line all the way to the county road. Very convenient for you. Tom shrugged. I'm a businessman, but I'm also trying to help you out of a bad situation that's only going to get worse. You're making enemies, Jake. Dangerous enemies. How long before something worse than cut fence happens? What if next time it's your house that gets vandalized? Or worse? The threat was barely veiled. Jake felt anger surging through him, hot and righteous. Get off my property, Tom, now. Think about it, Tom said, placing the paper on the porch railing. The offer's good for 1 week. After that, well, market conditions might change. Things might get harder for you. He walked back to his truck, paused before getting in. You're fighting for something that's already dead, Jake. The small family ranch is finished. You can accept that and walk away with something, or you can keep fighting and lose everything. Your choice. After Tom left, Jake sat on his porch steps, his head in his hands. He was at his lowest point, lower than he had ever been. The ranch was failing. The community had turned against him. Someone was actively sabotaging him, and now he was being offered a way out. A part of him, the tired, scared part, wanted to take it. Wanted to just give up, take the money, move to Phoenix near his daughter, get a job, doing something that didn't require 14-hour days and constant financial stress. He was still sitting there when Nala's truck pulled up an hour later. She got out and immediately saw that something was very wrong. She sat down next to him on the steps without saying anything, just waiting. Someone cut my fence last night, Jake finally said. 3 of my cattle were killed, the rest scattered all over. Cost me a fortune to round them up, and I'll be paying for damages to neighboring properties. Oh, Jake, Nala said quietly. Tom Brennan just came by, made me an offer to buy the ranch. Told me that things were only going to get worse if I kept fighting. He looked at her, and she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. Maybe he's right. Maybe I should just quit. Nala was quiet for a long moment. Then she began to speak, her voice soft but steady. When I was 16, my grandfather got very sick. Cancer. The doctors said he should go to the hospital in Phoenix for treatment, but he refused. He wanted to stay on the reservation, on the land. Some people in our family were angry with him, said he was being stubborn, that he should do whatever it took to live longer. She paused, remembering. One night, near the end, I asked him why he wouldn't go. He told me that living wasn't just about breathing and having a heartbeat. He said there were some things worth more than a few extra months of life. He said that how you face challenges, how you stand up for what you believe is right, even when it's hard. Jake listened, not interrupting. He told me a story about our people during the wars with the cavalry. There were times when surrender seemed like the only option, when fighting seemed pointless. But some of our ancestors kept fighting anyway, not because they thought they would win, but because giving up meant losing who they were. Survival isn't just about being alive. It's about preserving what matters. She turned to look at Jake directly. I'm not saying what you should do. This is your ranch, your life, your decision. But I want you to know something. The work we're doing matters. The data we've collected could help dozens of ranchers who are in the same position you are. If we stop now, if we let fear and threats silence us, then all those other ranchers will keep struggling with the same problems. But if we keep going, if we present our findings and show people there's another way, we might actually change things for the better. Jake sat silently, wrestling with his fears and his pride, his practical concerns and his deeper values. What if we keep fighting and I lose everything anyway? That's possible, Nala admitted. But what if we quit now, and later you realize you gave up right before things were about to turn around? What would that feel like? Jake thought about his grandfather, building this ranch when everyone said it couldn't be done. He thought about his father, working through droughts and recessions, never giving up. He thought about the land itself, harsh and beautiful, testing everyone who tried to make a life from it. He stood up, his decision made. We keep going. We do the presentation. We finish what we started. Nala smiled, relief evident on her face. Okay then. We keep going. What neither of them knew was that their troubles were far from over. The forces arrayed against them were about to make one more major move, and the crisis that was coming would test both of them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Jake and Nala spent the next 2 weeks preparing for their presentation with an intensity born of desperation and determination. They knew this was their chance to prove that their approach could work, that collaboration between ranchers and conservationists wasn't just possible but beneficial. Nala compiled every piece of data they had collected, creating charts and graphs that showed the improvements in soil health, water retention, plant diversity, and cattle weight gain. Jake contributed his financial records, showing that despite the initial investment of time and effort, the test plot was actually becoming more profitable than the traditional methods he had been using. They practiced the presentation in Jake's living room, taking turns speaking, anticipating questions, refining their message. Nala brought a professional polish to the scientific data, while Jake could speak from the heart about the practical realities of ranching. Together they made a compelling team. The Regional Conference on Sustainable Agriculture was being held in Tucson, a 3-hour drive from their area. It would attract ranchers, researchers, government officials, and representatives from agricultural organizations across the Southwest. It was exactly the audience they needed to reach, but it was also an audience that included people who were deeply skeptical of change. 3 days before they were scheduled to leave for the conference, Jake received an unexpected visitor. His daughter, Emma, drove up from Tucson where she lived with her husband and 2 young children. Jake hadn't seen her in nearly 6 months. The relationship had been strained ever since she had made it clear she wouldn't be continuing the family ranching tradition. She got out of her car and hugged her father tightly. Dad, I've been reading about what you're doing. The article in the newspaper, the presentation coming up. I wanted to come see for myself. Jake gave her a tour of the test plot, showing her the differences between it and the rest of the ranch. Emma walked slowly through the improved areas, touching the thicker grass, examining the healthier soil. She had grown up on this ranch, and even though she had chosen a different life, she still understood what she was seeing. This is remarkable, Dad, she said finally. I can actually see the difference. The grass is greener here, fuller. And you said the cattle are healthier? Gaining weight faster, fewer health problems? Jake confirmed. It's not magic, it's just working with the land instead of against it. They sat on the tailgate of his truck, looking out over the property. Emma was quiet for a moment, then said, I owe you an apology. When I left for college and decided not to come back to ranching, I thought you were disappointed in me. I thought you saw me as a quitter. I was never disappointed in you, Jake said firmly. Worried about the future of this place? Sure. But never disappointed in you for choosing your own path. The thing is, Emma continued, I left partly because I couldn't see a future in ranching. It seemed like it was dying, like no matter how hard you worked, you were just delaying the inevitable. But what you're doing now with Nala, this feels different. This feels like actually creating a future instead of just hanging on to the past. She turned to look at her father. I've been thinking. My background is in marketing and business management. What if I helped you develop this into something bigger? Not just saving your ranch, but creating a model that other ranchers could follow. We could document the whole process, create educational materials, Maybe even offer consulting services to other ranchers who want to transition to these methods. Jake was stunned. "You'd want to be involved in the ranch again?" "Not in the day-to-day cattle work," Emma clarified. "That's not my skill set. But the business side, the marketing, the educational outreach, that's what I'm good at. And if this approach really works as well as your data suggests, there's a real opportunity here. Ranchers are desperate for solutions. If we can show them a path forward that's both environmentally sustainable and profitable, that's something valuable." For the first time in months, Jake felt a spark of genuine hope. Having his daughter believe in what he was doing, wanting to be part of it, meant more than he could express. The day before the conference, Nala called with concerning news. "I just heard from a colleague who's attending the conference. Tom Brennan is registered to attend, and he's apparently been making calls to other ranchers, encouraging them to come specifically to challenge our presentation." Jake wasn't surprised. Of course he is. He sees this as a threat to his way of doing things. "Are you prepared for that?" Nala asked. "It could get confrontational. He might try to discredit our data or make this personal." "Let him come," Jake said. "We have the truth on our side. The data doesn't lie." The conference was held in a large hotel convention center. The main presentation hall could seat over 200 people. Jake and Nala arrived early, setting up their materials and testing the equipment. As people began filing in for their session, Jake recognized many faces from his own community. Tom Brennan sat in the third row, surrounded by his allies. But Jake also saw younger ranchers scattered throughout the audience, people who looked genuinely curious rather than hostile. When it was their turn to present, Nala began with the scientific overview. She explained the ecological principles behind their approach, using clear language that didn't require an advanced degree to understand. She showed photographs of the test plot compared to untreated areas, and the visual evidence was striking. She presented data on soil composition, water retention, and biodiversity. Then Jake took over, speaking about the practical implementation and the economic results. He was honest about the challenges, the learning curve, the skepticism he had faced, but he was also honest about the results. Healthier cattle, lower feed costs, improved land conditions that would benefit the ranch for years to come. "I'm not standing here telling you I have all the answers," Jake said to the audience. "I'm just a rancher who was running out of options and was willing to try something different. What I learned is that the traditional knowledge of the people who lived on this land for thousands of years before us, that knowledge has value. It's not about choosing between being a rancher and being an environmentalist. It's about being smart enough to use every tool available to survive and thrive." When they opened the floor for questions, Tom Brennan's hand shot up immediately. "This all sounds very nice," he said, his voice carrying an edge of sarcasm. "But let's talk about the real agenda here. Dr. Tozy works for a research institution that's funded by environmental groups. Those groups have openly stated they want to reduce or eliminate cattle ranching in the West. How do we know this isn't just a Trojan horse, a way to get ranchers to voluntarily adopt practices that will eventually be used to regulate us out of existence?" Nala remained calm. "My research is funded by a federal grant through the National Science Foundation, which is a neutral scientific institution. I have no agenda other than understanding how different land management practices affect ecosystems. The data I've presented today is objective and verifiable. Anyone can visit the test plot and see the results for themselves." Another rancher stood up. "But what happens when you publish this research and environmental groups use it to push for mandatory practices? What happens when this stops being voluntary?" Jake spoke up. "That's a fair concern. And I've had the same worry." "But here's what I've learned. Doing nothing isn't working. My ranch was failing. I was months away from bankruptcy. I could either try something new or lose everything. The methods we've tested aren't about following someone else's rules. They're about being smarter and more adaptive. And the best part is they're working. My cattle are healthier, my land is recovering, and for the first time in years I'm actually making a profit." A younger woman near the back raised her hand. "I'm interested in trying this on my family's ranch, but I wouldn't know where to start. Are you planning to offer any kind of training or guidance?" Emma, who had been sitting in the audience, stood up. "Actually, that's something we're working on developing. We're planning to create educational resources and potentially offer consulting services to help other ranchers implement these practices. If you're interested, we'll have information available after the presentation." The questions continued for another 30 minutes. Some were skeptical, some were genuinely curious, some were openly hostile, but Jake and Nala handled each one with patience and honesty, never overpromising, always returning to the data and the results. After the session ended, something unexpected happened. Instead of everyone immediately leaving, a group of about 20 ranchers, mostly younger ones, gathered around Jake and Nala, asking detailed questions about implementation. They wanted to know specifics: how often to rotate cattle, which native plants worked best, how to approach controlled burns safely, where to find more information about traditional Apache land management practices. Tom Brennan watched from a distance, his expression unreadable. A few of his supporters came over to talk to him, but Jake noticed that several others had joined the group around him and Nala instead. The solidarity Tom had counted on was fracturing. Over the next hour, Jake and Nala found themselves at the center of an impromptu workshop, drawing diagrams on napkins, exchanging phone numbers, and making plans for site visits. The enthusiasm was infectious and genuine. These weren't people looking for a handout or a magic solution. They were working ranchers, desperate for practical ways to survive and willing to learn. One old-timer approached Jake quietly. "I knew your grandfather," he said. "He was a stubborn old cuss, but he was smart enough to adapt when he needed to. I think he'd be proud of what you're doing here." The validation from someone of his grandfather's generation meant everything to Jake. 3 months later, Jake stood in the same spot where Nala had first saved him from the rattlesnake. It felt like a lifetime ago, though it had only been about 9 months. The test plot had now expanded to encompass nearly a third of his ranch, and the results continued to exceed their expectations. More importantly, 7 other ranchers from the region had started implementing similar practices on their properties, with Jake and Nala providing guidance. Emma had moved back to help manage what had become a small consulting business built around sustainable ranching practices. She handled the business side while Jake and Nala provided the technical expertise. It wasn't making them rich, but it was sustainable and growing. The local feed store, Morrison's Feed and Supply, had started carrying native grass seeds after several customers requested them. Carl, the owner who had warned Jake about working with Nala, had quietly apologized a few weeks earlier. "I was scared," he had admitted. "Scared of change, scared of losing my business. I was wrong to take that out on you." Tom Brennan had never apologized, and Jake didn't expect him to. But the act of hostility had stopped. Some people thought it was because Tom realized he couldn't stop the momentum of change. Others whispered that it was because his own son had approached Jake about implementing some of the practices on a section of the Brennan Ranch, and Tom didn't want to alienate his own family. Nala's research had been published in a prestigious scientific journal, bringing attention from researchers across the country. She had been invited to speak at conferences and had even been approached about writing a book. More importantly to her, the tribal council had asked her to develop a program teaching young people on the reservation about traditional ecological knowledge, combining it with modern scientific methods. On this particular morning, Nala had come out to help Jake install some wildlife cameras in a new section they were monitoring. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from people who have been through difficult times together and come out stronger. "You know what's funny?" Jake said as they finished mounting a camera. "That rattlesnake that brought us together. I think about it sometimes. If you hadn't been there that day, if you hadn't saved me, none of this would have happened. I'd probably have lost the ranch by now." Nala smiled. "Or maybe you would have found another way. You're stubborn enough. Maybe. But I'm glad it happened the way it did. I'm glad you were there. I'm glad you had the patience to teach an old cowboy some new tricks." "You taught me some things too," Nala said. "About persistence, about fighting for what matters, about bridging divides. My grandfather would have liked you." They walked back toward the ranch house, where Emma was preparing lunch. As they walked, they observed the land around them, healthier than it had been in years, showing signs of recovery and resilience. Wildlife that had been scarce was returning. The cattle that grazed there were thriving. Nick thought about the journey that had brought them here, from a moment of danger to a partnership that had transformed not just his ranch, but his entire perspective on what was possible. He thought about the ranchers who had initially opposed them but were now curious about their methods. He thought about his daughter, reconnected to the family legacy in a way that honored both tradition and innovation. "You know what this proves?" Jake said as they reached the house. "What's that?" "That sometimes the scariest moments in life are actually opportunities in disguise. That rattlesnake could have killed me, but instead it led to all of this. It brought together 2 people who had no reason to meet, from 2 different worlds, and showed that those differences could be strengths instead of barriers." Nala laughed. "That's very poetic for a cowboy. I'm a rancher philosopher now," Jake said with a grin. "It's a new career path." Inside the house, Emma had prepared a lunch of sandwiches and fresh lemonade. As they sat around the kitchen table, the same table where Jake's grandfather used to sit, where his father had planned out ranch work, where Jake himself had faced so many lonely meals, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope for the future. The ranch that had seemed destined to die was being reborn. The community that had been fractured was slowly healing. The land that had been struggling was recovering, and most importantly, what had seemed like an impossible divide between different people, different cultures, and different ways of thinking had been bridged by mutual respect, shared challenges, and a willingness to learn. As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, warming the old kitchen, Jake raised his glass. "To rattlesnakes," he said, "and to the people brave enough to handle them." Nala and Emma raised their glasses, laughing. "To new beginnings," Emma added. "To partnerships that change everything," Nala said. They clinked their glasses together, three people from different backgrounds, different generations, and different perspectives, united by a common purpose and a shared hope for what could be built when people chose collaboration over conflict, when they honored both tradition and innovation, and when they recognized that survival, true survival, meant adapting, learning, and growing together. Outside, the desert wind blew gently across the recovering land, carrying with it the promise of seasons to come, of challenges that would be faced and overcome, of a future that was being written not by fear but by courage, not by division but by unity, and not by clinging to the past but by building something new from the wisdom of what came before.